Hello and welcome to Fine is a four-letter word. My guest today is Jen Berlingo. Welcome to the show, Jen.
Hi, how are you, Lori?
I'm doing well. We were introduced through Yvonne Marchese. And I said it
Yes.
right. Yes, I win.
Yay. Yeah, she's
You- you-
great.
she is. Yvonne was a recent guest on my show, and I've been a guest on her show as well. And so I am grateful just to, for her to have made this introduction. Jen, let's start with the question that I love asking all of my guests, which is, what were the beliefs and values that you were raised with as a child, and how did they affect you as you were growing into an adult?
It's a big question.
Yes.
Yeah, I was born in 1975 in like southeastern Virginia. So in the South during that time, there were, I guess, in my family and in my surroundings, really just a conservative sort of nature. Homophobia, racism, a tight grip on monogamy and pseudo-Christianity sort of, you know, um, in there, mixed in there. And I guess I was raised in a family that was very loving, very hyper vigilantly so, I would say. And, had a really like on paper beautiful childhood. And the climate, I think, during that time, and in my home, it was really like about having, um, being a good girl, being a people pleaser,
Mm-hmm.
being, I guess, like even when I was little, and I talk about this in my book a bit, being an easy baby was prized, and I realized that very early on. And so it was like, there's this quote by Bethany Webster about having to choose between being empowered and being loved is sort of the dilemma of like a female child
Mm.
growing up in this time. And I think I really felt that in the sense of not being able to express my needs, or when I did express needs, it was like, oh, you're okay, or oh, you're being too sensitive, that sort of thing. So,
Yeah,
um,
like they were
yeah,
dismissed.
somewhat, or appease, sort of that
Yeah.
like that pat on the back, like, oh,
Mhm.
there, it's fine. And then just to be like the happy, smiling, performing, daughter. I was quite a perfectionist as a kid. I got straight A's, did all the right things. When I didn't do the right things, I was very good at hiding them in terms of, like some of the rebellious teenage stuff, early
Right.
experimentation, sex, drugs types of things. But I didn't get caught in that. It was like I was very much, yeah, very, very much the good girl in a lot of ways, and had a really good relationship with my family.
Yeah, it's surprising to me that, I mean, 1975, I was
Hmm.
already like that wasn't that long ago. And
Right.
to still have those values be so strong is,
Hmm.
I don't know, it's just surprising to me. I I mean, obviously I was a child then too, but
Yeah.
it seems like when we talk about like the racism and the sexism and like it's almost like, well, wait a second, wasn't that like in the 1940s? But
Right.
it
I
was
know it's hard to
actually
believe.
it's still in our lifetime and still going on today in some
Very
parts.
much so. Yeah, very much so.
Even
I
in
mean, there's been
our
a lot of
country, which
progress.
we consider ourselves like such a developed country,
Yeah.
and yet
Yeah. Yet it's still, yeah, we still have a long way to go, even though we have made a lot of progress. I'm hopeful, especially looking at the generation coming up. I have an almost 17-year-old, and, I really feel like their generation has much, I don't know, more values that reflect my own. So I feel like hopeful that it's
yeah.
changing, but it's slow change. And I think it's regional too, in a lot of ways in our country. So, um, yeah, I have a lot of thoughts. I think I could go on for a long time about the politics of it all, but yeah, I think like growing up, I really I wanted to be accepted, I wanted to be loved, and I knew to do that, I needed to sort of play by the rules, not rock the boat, make sure my caregivers were comfortable and appeased. And I feel like I had somewhat of a consciousness about that as a kid. But I was definitely I talk about like the messages that you get when you're a child, and how they shape you, how they shape, when you're forming your own adult life. And they're called introjects, like in psychology speak, like the messages that kind of become internalized and we start to hear them in our own voice eventually. So it's like my dad's voice as a perfectionist and my mom's voice, as like a caregiver and soother. All of that becomes like my own inner dialogue, which definitely was formative for me. And I find that in most of my clients who are also recovering good girls and recovering people pleasers in midlife.
Yeah. Yeah. So that is so interesting because a lot of times I talk in my programs and we talk on the show about the beliefs that have been wired into you since
Mm-hmm.
in like even before birth,
Yeah.
those beliefs. And so in psychology, they're called, what did you say they were? Introcepts?
Introjects.
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 Jeez.
Yeah.
Okay. Introjects.
It's a Jungian
Got it.
term. Mm-hmm.
That's the other term. Right. And what you just said about them becoming your own voice,
Yeah.
that's what I think a lot of us don't like. We think it's our own, we came up with it. Like it's our voice
Right.
because it's been so ingrained for so long that it does become our voice, but it didn't start out as our voice.
Right. Yeah. I think it's like, it carves those neural pathways where it's like, this is just the way things are. And this is how my self-talk becomes, the parent talk becomes the self-talk. And we can't really discern that, especially as children, that that's even happening. And I think we can become conscious of it, later in life. We can start to say, wait, what is my core self? Where is my authentic self? And try to peel back the layers of familial, cultural, social, conditioning that have been put on top of us to allow us to adapt to an environment where we had to survive. I mean, it's really a
Yeah.
brilliant survival mechanism. And when we had to use it as such. But in adulthood, especially midlife and beyond, it's like, oh, wait, that doesn't actually need to protect me anymore. I don't have to, you know, be the people pleaser or try to make everyone else comfortable at my own expense. Like that really isn't going to serve. Um, but it may have served up until now, and that's perfectly okay and healthy, and sometimes needs to be shaken up later in life.
Absolutely. Yeah. And which is why so many people go through what has commonly in the past been referred to as a midlife crisis. I'm not a fan of that term,
Me neither, as you know.
but yes. But how does somebody recognize that one, those beliefs aren't serving them, or two, that they can be changed?
Yeah, I think it's a process, a slow process sometimes, of just really turning an ear inward and listening to your inner call, and your inner voice, and really just seeing. Like, I think what I find with the clients that I've worked with the last couple decades, it's like they come in and it's much like the title of your podcast, everything's fine. Like on the surface, it's fine. I have the life that I prepared for and that I worked really hard to get, and I should be happy and I should be, satisfied. Yet there's something in them that's like quaking, this like dissatisfaction, and then a second arrow of guilt or shame about not being satisfied with an absolutely beautiful existence or life. And then, saying like, well, what is it? What needs to change? And how can I even do that? And it's really hard because the stakes are pretty high at midlife when we're
Mm-hmm.
settled into careers and mortgages and marriages and children or taking care of elderly parents, all of the things that happen in midlife, right? And we don't have a lot of roadmaps or cheerleaders that are really wanting us to unfurl into our more aligned ways of being in the world. So that's really what I try to do, because I went through that myself. I really felt like, oh, is this all there is? And like, I was when I started out my 40s, which midlife spans 40 to 65 in developmental psychology. But there, people can self determine when midlife
Sure.
is, and it can be
Sure.
2 years before, a few years after. But usually, the decade of the 40s coming into it is sort of this turning point that shakes up whatever hasn't been exposed, whatever has been previously concealed becomes seen or is asked to become conscious and seen, which is why I call my work and my book Midlife Emergence instead of crisis, because emergence is the process of coming into view after
Yeah.
being previously concealed.
I love that. And when you just said it, it reminds me of a butterfly.
Yeah,
Like
very
we've
much so.
been in this cocoon and now we're emerging out, and there's a
Yeah.
fight to do that when in a butterfly, like they have to fight to get out of the cocoon,
Yeah.
and it's
And
hard and
it's
it's challenge. Yeah.
Yeah, it's even like it's like you're the caterpillar for a really long time, right? And then,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and if we apply it to a human lifespan, and then you
Right.
go into the cocoon, and the caterpillar becomes absolute and complete goo. They decompose entirely, which I feel like is what the midlife emergence crisis
Right.
feels like. It's like, oh, I don't have any structure anymore. It's not even like that caterpillar body is the center of the butterfly. It's just like total goo. And then you remake yourself new. And it
Mm-hmm.
might be some form that surprises those around you who've known you, loved you, expect you to be a certain way. And then you emerge as the butterfly, and you can't actually pull a butterfly out of its cocoon. Like you were saying, they have to fight for it. They have to actually get the strength of the wings themselves to do it. So it's a perfect
Right,
metaphor.
because
I never used that word.
if
Perfect.
you help a butterfly out of its cocoon, it will die because its wings
Right.
won't be strong enough to help to for it to fly. Yeah, exactly. Which is something that a lot of people, everybody who wants to be helpful wants to help you. Like, let me cut you out and help you, but it actually hurts. Yeah.
Exactly.
So anyway,
Excuse me.
sorry. Go on with your story there.
No, sorry. I just took a sip of water and hit my throat.
No
Um,
choking.
yeah. So I think like I guess I feel like the 40s are that liminal space between the first and second act of life
Mm.
when we have the opportunity to really consciously architect the way we want to live into our second half. So um yeah, and for me that just looked like realizing a lot of things that I knew about myself that I had pushed down in order to have this beautiful life where I was married to a man who is still my best friend, who is amazing. And we had been together since we were 23. And we now, like I said, have an almost 17-year-old. And, I had a private practice going. I was living in the Bay Area. I was having, I have great friends, all of this on paper, great. But then like something stirring inside of me. And for me, a big piece of it had to do with my sexuality, having known my whole life that I was queer, but not living a visibly queer life and feeling quite invisible in that way. And knowing that that was actually feeling
Mm-hmm.
really toxic for me, the invisibility of my queerness and my true self, because I'm always assumed to be heterosexual when I was like out in the world with him, right? And he knew that too. It wasn't like
Mm-hmm.
a secret or anything, but wanting to really have that part of myself come forward more fully and having those yearnings. And I realized that that would potentially destroy the life that I had worked really carefully to have. So it takes a lot of courage, I think, to really go beyond, what we've been taught is okay, and to turn toward the parts of ourselves that might be more subversive and perhaps not as accepted. Um, there were other changes and pieces for me in terms of location and career shifts and all sorts of things that happened in that decade, which my clients experience as well. I think it's pretty common to reevaluate, and it's an opportunity more than a crisis. I think if we frame it that way.
Yeah, I completely agree. I completely agree with you as far as it being an opportunity. And I think, I mean, you say you knew from an early age who you
Mm-hmm.
really were, but you were
Yeah.
afraid to express and live into that person.
Right.
And I find a lot of people I talk to that we know, like we know.
Mm-hmm. You know.
It's because
Yeah.
it's who we are at our soul.
Right.
And yet it's about the I don't know. I'm working right now on the whole thing around confidence versus courage, and it's not versus,
Mm.
but is it we need more confidence, or is it we need more courage, or is it the
Mm.
combination of the two? How they're very
Yeah.
tightly woven together, but they're different.
They
Um,
really are. Yeah.
and as we get older, as we're into our 40s and 50s, I think we find more self-confidence, which
Mm-hmm.
gives us more courage
Right.
to step into who we really are instead of
Yeah.
going along
Yeah.
with what society tells us we should be or how we should be.
Yeah,
Do you
yeah, I
think
love your
that's like
distinction
that
there.
was contributing to what you were doing too, as far as having more self-confidence to stand in who you were?
I think so. I feel like the courage maybe had to come first for me, and I wonder that with people, which is first, right? Like, I
Right.
I was I did it afraid. I don't know that I felt completely ready or confident, but I did know that I there wasn't a choice to make. It was like I didn't have a choice but to be myself and to bring all of myself
Hmm.
forward. And that required, well, maybe courage and confidence, but I think courage really to first voice it to my then husband, to let him know what was happening on the inside first.
Yeah.
And then, we did all sorts of therapy and reading and thinking about how are we
Uh-huh.
going to do this? Do we want to open our marriage? Do we want, what's going to happen? And that I did it scared. I think that sometimes we have to just do it scared. And that doesn't mean we're not courageous. I mean, I think sometimes that's a lot of what courage is doing things afraid, and confidence in some way, and
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm
yeah,
glad you just mentioned that because I was going to say it if you didn't, that having courage doesn't mean you're not scared.
right. Yeah, I think even voicing that you're scared is courageous, because that's also
Yes.
something that's not socially accepted necessarily. It's like, oh,
Right.
you're so brave because you did the thing. It's like, oh, you're so scared and you said you were scared, or you listened to your inner instinct to not do the thing. That's also courageous because you're listening to your inner voice.
Yeah.
So I think that really it just has to do with following, our authentic impulses. And I guess in the way of like, not holding back from disappointing others, when the alternative is to disappoint ourselves. And that is a really challenging thing for someone who's been conditioned as a people pleaser or a good girl, to actually disappoint the people that we love the most. And, people who might expect us to stay in a certain box or in a certain way. But life is long, and sometimes we have lots of lives to lead. Sometimes we have to be the butterfly too.
Yes. Yes. And you just mentioned, well, so in your book, which
Mhm.
remind my listeners, or not remind them, tell them in the first place, what's the name of your book?
Sure. My book is called Midlife Emergence: Free Your Inner Fire. And it's a teaching memoir, which is part memoir and part like personal growth. And so it's really my story of emergence in the decade of my 40s and facing a lot of these things. But I identify like 13 different common midlife themes. And at the end of each chapter, I invite the reader into their own self inquiry work around that theme through journaling, through art, through personal ritual and ceremony, different ways of contacting what that inner voice is saying to you. So everyone's story is different. It's not necessarily a book for people coming out later in life, although a lot of people I work with or who are drawn to the book have that story, but a lot don't. A lot of them are just contemplating maybe a career shift or something in their relationship or in their friendships or whatever it might be for you. It's applicable there in the prompts, but it goes through
Yeah.
like the story of my own midlife.
Yeah, and I've been reading through it, and it is the exercises are great. The story, I mean, people are always interested in other people's stories,
Yeah,
and
I do think
so
memoir is like naturally instructive. In some way, you don't need
yeah,
the prompts part, but I wanted to add that because I feel like with my background as a therapist and coach and art therapist, that it really helps to invite the reader into their own work.
it does. And when somebody's reading, they're seeing what, like, oh, okay, Jen did this, Jen did that, but how? How did she do it? Like, if I wanted to
Hmm.
do it, how did you do it? And that's often a question I ask my guests is like, okay, so you went through this experience where things were fine, but they weren't
Hmm.
fine. And
Right.
then all of a sudden now you're over here on this other path,
Hmm.
but there's a disconnect. Like, what happened in between there? And so by providing those exercises, you give people the tools to move move themselves from one place to another. I wanted to go back to, though, in your book, you talk about, we were just talking about the disappointing others and how
Yeah.
that was something that was, and you mentioned it in the beginning too, about being conditioned to
Hmm.
not disappoint others and being raised to as that self-sacrifice was the whole point of life, basically.
Yeah, in some ways. I mean, I come from a long line of martyrs in a way, just women who are giving of themselves and really prized for it. Like, oh, she's so great. She does everything for everyone else and always, bakes casseroles for people who are sick, like all of the giving, giving, giving until they're empty. And I know that that's a virtue in my family and probably many others around that generation. Um, yeah, so it does feel there's just a phrase sometimes in my head when I hear people say like must be nice, like is
Mm.
something I love to hate because it feels like that energy sort of when I in my late 20s went back to graduate school to become a therapist, and it was like I was doing a lot of personal growth work, and I was in therapy myself as a requirement of the program and a requirement for me as a human because I feel like I love therapy and get so much out of it.
Yeah.
And anytime I would talk about any sort of self-care type of thing, the feeling that I would get, and it maybe wasn't in those words, was like, oh, it must be nice that you're able to do all of that. And it's like, oh no, it's not a selfish thing. It's a way of becoming responsible for my own,
Yeah.
life. And it's not a language that my family spoke necessarily or speaks. Um, yeah. And I think it's like to disappoint others, and really to try to come to terms with satisfying yourself. The ground drops out in a way of like the safety and security that we've developed and that we've like tried to maintain in relationships. We're risking that, and so it can be pretty scary. But there's another, well, Eric Erickson is a psychologist from the 50s, and he talks
Hmm.
about the struggle in midlife. Every like developmental stage of life has this challenge, and the challenge of midlife, he says, is stagnation versus generativity, which
Hmm.
is really where we're reevaluating to make sure we're making the type of impact we want to make. And so sometimes we can feel stagnant when we're clinging to the habits that have helped us feel safe and secure and stable. And that familiarity feels super nice to our nervous systems,
Yes.
Um,
Yes.
but when I was researching my book and I interviewed over 100 women about this, they talked about how there was more seduction into like the mystery and a yearning for something more and something more generative and something that would be growth producing and help them evolve than there was the clinging toward the what was safe and secure. So there seems to be more of a urge toward that generativity or like a natural progression into wanting to continue to expand and grow. um, and so that risk is worth it a lot of times, and it doesn't mean it has to be like this huge volcanic eruption of blowing up your whole beautiful life, but it can be like small 1 degree turns toward what feels more authentic and what feels more growth producing.
Yeah. Thank you for saying that. It doesn't have to be a seismic shift. It could
No.
be, it might
Mm-hmm.
be, but it doesn't have to be. Even that 1 degree. Like I've heard, I'm not a pilot, but planes that are even 1 degree off from flying on their path are going to end up somewhere completely different than where they're supposed to
Totally.
be from just 1 degree. And so
Yes.
that same thing could happen, is just a small shift could make have a major impact on someone's
Yeah,
life.
exactly. Yeah, it's a great metaphor for that.
And you mentioned too the that calling
Hmm.
to, I believe that that is your soul like crying out for like, hey, you're here to live bigger than this, or differently, more differently than this. You're here to
Yes.
do bigger than what you have done so far.
Right.
And
Right.
pay attention to this, pay attention to this. I think though a lot of times people, like you said, they're afraid because it's uncomfortable and it's
Hmm.
different. And what's that saying? Nobody likes change other than a baby with a wet diaper.
Yeah. Change
They're
is
the only ones who
really
like change.
uncomfortable. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, change is
But
really uncomfortable
at
and
the
it's all we
same
have.
time, right, right, exactly. There
Yeah.
is nothing, life is change, and
Yes.
it's more uncomfortable in the end to not change.
Right. It's
Because
true.
and so one of the things I thought about when I was making some major changes and have been still. Like I still, I'm out here living nomad life. So it's a
Yeah,
big
that's
change.
awesome.
But asking yourself the question, when I'm 80 or when I'm on my deathbed or whatever, will I regret not having done this thing?
Exactly.
And what is the cost of not doing it?
I fully live that way. I feel like there's an urgency sometimes around this point in life because we realize our mortality more so, than we did, whether it's health issues or
Yeah.
caring for aging parents or whatever that is. Just looking at, okay, what is my life about? And like, I have to do that now. This is my one life I get to live and remember, and I want to wring it dry of all of the juiciness that it has to offer. And how am I not doing that? And I felt that burning so hot. And I still do. It's not like that goes away, but I feel like there are waves of it. And it came up really strongly for me in my early 40s of, yeah, what am I not doing? What am I not living that I really would have wanted to? What path, have I not taken that I may have regretted not taking, or that I would regret not taking going forward? And I feel like some of some of those things, when we identify them, can be like a way to listen to the inner voice. Like when we hear that in ourselves. And another thing that I think helps us know it's a soul calling, and this seems weird at first, but envy. I feel like when we feel envy, when we're watching someone else's life play out in a way, or we hear something great about someone, like, oh, that person got some award or got some job or whatever it might be, or got married, or, like that feeling of envy that comes up, that's like not like a jealousy that you don't want them to have it, but like I want that for myself. And so that there's like
Yeah.
a bitter taste to that. I feel like that is such a gift because it really points us toward true desire. It's like there's something about that that I would like to have in this life for myself. And yeah, I feel like those things can be compasses, really easy kind of compasses for those who may not be as, I don't know, used to really listening internally, or they're like, what does that even mean? I think that some of those ways are
Yes.
easy to grasp.
Yes, that's so good. That is such a good point of, because we're often taught, again, like envy is a quote unquote bad thing. And I love how
Mm-hmm.
it could be a signpost for you to pay attention to. Hey, yeah, because if it's like being aware of like feelings or things that come up for you that are, they don't come up for everybody. Like what you are
Right,
envious of, I might not be.
right,
But we don't realize that. We're like, well, wouldn't everybody be envious of that? Of course. Like,
right.
no,
But no,
that's a
yeah,
unique thing to you. Yeah.
it is. It's really personal,
Yeah.
and
And
it's
paying
really
attention
like,
to it, like, okay.
yeah. And I think it can really point us toward who we truly want to be or who we're becoming. And in the last chapter of my book, I have an invitation and a link to an audio. If you have the audio book, it's actually in there, but in the other versions, you can link to it. There is a future self visualization exercise where it's kind of yourself projected 20 years into the future talking to you now. And it's just a brief meditation basically, and then some writing prompts after it. And I feel like I've done that repeatedly over the last decade or so. I guess it's been about a decade now that I've been doing that exercise in different ways. And it is such a way of, for me, it's like my future self is sort of this muse who I am living into. I look to the visual of that person and think each day when I'm making even little decisions, like, would she wear this? Where would she want to go to eat? It's sort of like courting that one of you who is to be, and like the most ideal, or not necessarily ideal, but like the version that you really hope for. And it really makes it
Mm-hmm.
tangible. And I feel like that also helps with that thing we were just talking about of the regrets or not regrets. Like, how will you become her? So I think that that's also a
Yeah.
really great exercise to do.
Yeah, absolutely. I love that you're talking about future self, um,
Mm-hmm.
because I think well, we could go down a whole different rabbit hole on this conversation about people taking care of themselves today so that their future self, like if to benefit their future self. And so many people don't even think about that. They think about, what can I do today that will bring me immediate joy, immediate satisfaction? And, you know, screw future me. She'll deal with herself when she gets there, you know, like, right. But it could be as simple as making your bed so that future you tonight can get into a nicely made bed with clean sheets. You know, it doesn't have to be 10 years down the road, because that's too far to think sometimes.
Right. Exactly. And doing kind things for that one of you, you know, to come. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Cool. So, where are we going with this now? There were other, I was going to mention the thing about regrets, because you mentioned the regrets, and I was just I was looking away as I was talking, because I wanted to look up the name of the guy who wrote the book about regrets that I love. Do you know who I'm talking about?
I don't think.
All right, hang on. I'm going to look him up, because he's it's not top 5 regrets of the dying. It's The Power of Regret. Right. Dan Pink. Love Dan Pink. Are you familiar?
I'm not, no.
Oh, he's written a whole bunch of books. But I think it's his newest. It came out a couple of years ago, called The Power of Regret, How Looking Backward Moves Us Forward. And he talked in that book about how having regrets is not necessarily a bad thing. Like, people think, I want to live without regrets. Well, regrets, like what you were talking about earlier, help point you in the direction that you would like to go. Like, if you regret not doing something in the past and you have the opportunity to do it now, or you take actions based on regrets you had in the past, so that moving forward, future you doesn't have a regret.
Absolutely. Yes. I think, I think about that a lot with paths not taken, you know, and then how we have the opportunity to maybe take them now. And I write about this in my book, and it's kind of silly, but I don't know if you remember that movie Sliding Doors.
I was just going to say that. I was just going to bring that up, because I remember reading that in the book, and I'm like, oh my God, I talk about that movie all the time. I love that movie.
Yeah, me too. I don't know how it was so impactful, but it was like, I watched it.
And it was like a kind of random, it was kind of a, it wasn't a very popular movie. I don't think a lot of people knew about it or saw it.
Yeah. I mean, it had Gwyneth Paltrow, but early in her career. And it was like, I watched it as I was, it kind of prompted in a way, in a small way, a breakup that I was about to go through after college. So it was like, I watched it and saw in the movie, basically you see her life play out in one way when she catches her partner cheating. And then, you know, she kind of empowers herself and becomes this, like, she does a whole lot of things like in her career and everything. And then the other where she just remains blind to the fact that there was infidelity, and lives a more meek life, that where she has a lot of doubts and isn't able to, you know, make these sort of major moves in her and the rest of the areas of her life. And so I remember watching that and feeling, just feeling like it was cool to see the parallel lives and how they would play out, and wondering about my own, you know, if I were to stay in this relationship or not, or these sorts of things. And it felt, I think about it a lot. I think about that concept of what's me in a parallel universe doing, and do I want to be doing that and hop over there or not?
Right.
Yeah.
Because again, we could go on for a whole other conversation about parallel universes, because I actually believe that there are parallel universes that we, in a different life choice or life path, are living somewhere else.
Yeah. And we can call that in, like, if it is something where you think, you know, oh gosh, in a parallel universe, you know, like I would have thought, like, oh, I'm a queer woman and I'm like, oh, okay, actually, I want that. Like, this is something that I, you know, haven't been living or hadn't been living. And just really trying to, it kind of hones in on, like, the regret, like you were saying, like using it as a tool for, you know, future planning or manifesting.
Yeah, inspiration.
Yeah, inspiration. That's a better word than manifesting, for sure.
Well, they go hand in hand. So
yeah.
Awesome. All right. So one, I highly recommend that if you're listening to this episode, that you hop over to where does somebody go to get your book? because they
Yeah,
definitely are going to
well,
want to hear the rest of your story.
thank you. My book is available anywhere you buy books online, Amazon and elsewhere. You can ask your independent bookstores to order it as well. It's available that way. But yeah, it's in paperback, ebook, and audiobook. And you can find out more about my book and my offerings. Everything is on my website, which is just my name, jenberlingo.com, JenBerlingo.com. Yeah, and you can find me all over the place actually too. Like I write weekly on Substack. I have a Substack called Prism, where if you want more up-to-date writing or you read my book and you want more on these sorts of topics, I'm on Substack there. And um, I offer one-to-one midlife coaching, and I offer a lot of guided or guided and self-paced online programs. And I have applications open for a 12-week midlife emergence group guidance program that I run. I've run annually for the past few years, and it's going to happen once it's full sometime in 2024. So applications are open for that as well. And I'm all
Okay.
over social media. Instagram's my
Yeah.
favorite. It's just my name, Jen Berlingo.
Okay, cool. I will put links to all of that in the show notes. And as you were talking, I was like, oh, but wait, we didn't cover the one other thing, which is also why people are going to need to go get your book, is the thing about the astrology and the north
Oh yeah.
nodes and the south nodes. And I just found that really fascinating. We're not going to go into it all, but I mean, I'm semi into astrology. I don't know a lot
Mm-hmm.
about it, but I'm fascinated by it. And I had never heard of this whole thing of north nodes and south nodes and how they also can point you in the direction that maybe makes sense for your life at this point in time.
Yes. Yeah, I'm not an astrologer either, but I consult with one annually on my birthday, and I've consulted with the same one, and I write about him in my book. He's great, but he's taught me quite a bit, and I've studied on my own bits and pieces since I was like 11.
Yeah,
I don't do
yeah,
astrology. But it's really great. Like astrologers actually call the midlife crisis the Uranus opposition. And so there is like a planetary thing around age 42. And so if you're into that sort of thing, I talk about that a little bit in my book. I have one chapter that's dedicated to some of this, and some of the activities, and it have to do with the lunar nodes that you're talking about, the north and south node, your karmic past, and then like your highest vision would be your north node of what you are capable of growing into, but there's free will, of course, in doing that. So
yeah.
yeah, check out that part too.
It was fascinating because I went and did, like, you talk about, you mentioned how to find out what they
Yep.
are, and so I went
Right.
and did it, and I was like, oh, what,
Yeah.
this makes sense.
Totally. Right.
It's so
It does for
cool.
me too. Yeah, he did that with me, and I was like, oh, this explains a whole lot.
Right,
And I
right, right.
hadn't
Exactly.
known that. And
Yeah,
yeah, I love doing that with clients as well
that
too. So
is so cool. All
that's a
right,
fun part.
before we go, I got to ask you the last question that everybody gets, and that is, what's your hype song when you need an extra boost of energy?
It is when you had told me that you were going to ask this, and I've heard your podcast before, I'm like, oh no, I have entire playlists for this. So
Yes,
it's
I
very
know.
hard
So do I. But
to narrow it down. But yeah, the one that I'll say today is Ape Shit by the Carters. The Carters are Beyonce and Jay-Z, because that's their last name, and that it's on the album that they did together. And yeah, it has a four-letter word in it as well. But
well, I don't.
it's a great pump up song.
I now I have to go listen to it. Like, I feel like I've probably heard it, but maybe didn't know the name of it.
Yeah, it's
So
called Ape Shit.
yeah, all right, ape shit. I got to go look that up right now,
That's
and
awesome.
and have a listen. Jen, thank you so much for being my guest on Fine is a Four-Letter Word.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Lori. This has been fun.